Want to remind folks that we do have Seattle Channel live streaming the meeting today for our discussion last meeting, and we're asking that folks use the, I guess we're using wireless mics. A few of us have them, and I think we have some handheld mics too, but we're asking folks wait to stop until they're actually holding the mic so that Seattle Channel can actually pick up the audio. Another sort of housekeeping business, there's just nothing to be concerned about. It just, I feel an obligation to remind everybody that our emails are considered public records. So they're subject to the public disclosure laws, and we're not doing anything that should not be subject to public disclosure, but I just want to remind folks that that is actually the atmosphere that we're operating in. Additionally, as it relates to requests for information from the folks who are staffing this effort, Ashley Harris has been compiling the task force member requests for central staff, and we understand that people have a lot of questions, and our central staff is being really diligent in trying to organize and present the relevant information actually based on the questions that you're sending their way. My office, as well as Councilmember Gonzalez's office, has been working with central staff to streamline that information, and at the same time, this task force has a really specific scope and time frame, so we're trying to do the best that we can to address all the questions that task force have, knowing that we may not have the capacity to fully answer each and every question. With that, I'd love to just do a quick round of introductions. And for the new folks, if you could just give a little bit more detail like we did at our first meeting, just say a couple sentences about why you're interested in joining us and helping us do this work. Daniel?
Hi, I'm Daniel Malone with Downtown Emergency Service Center.
Andrew Koch with SEIU 1199, and I work at Downtown Emergency Services Center.
Ian Eisenberg, Uncle Ike's small business owner.
Jennifer Adams, a Bridge Care Center and scofflaw mitigation team.
Courtney O'Toole, Nicholsville, Share Wheel, and Housing for All.
Samantha Grad, UFCW 21.
A Tony Toe Home Site nonprofit in Southeast Seattle.
Kirsten Harris Talley with Progress Alliance of Washington, and also a small business partner with Black and Tan Hall.
Councilmember Lisa Herbold, representing West Seattle and South Park, District 1.
I'm Eric Sund of the City Council Central Staff.
Alan Lee, also with Council Central Staff.
And Tracy Ratzliff, also with Central Staff. Ashley Harrison, Legislative Department.
Shannon Perez-Darby with Councilmember Herbold's office.
Tom Matthews with Walsh Construction Company.
I'm one of the new guys, so I'll speak for a moment. I'm Chris Makett. I'm the founder and co-owner of the Chaco Canyon Organic Cafes in West Seattle University District and Greenwood, and I'm a lifelong Seattle resident. I think this is the greatest city on earth, and I want to do what we can to make it continue to be great in the midst of the great changes that we're seeing.
My name is Josiah Wirtz. I'm a small business owner at Cafe Red at Othello Station. I'm also chair of the board of the Martin Luther King Business Association, representing the businesses along the MLK corridor. Also one of the new people. I'm here because I strongly believe in progressive taxes.
I'm Bree Little from Real Change.
Katie Wilson from the Transit Riders Union and Housing for All Coalition.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So just a quick review of today's agenda, after we review the agenda, we'll also get a quick update from the caucuses. We will be discussing the policy briefs that have been developed by central staff. Those policy briefs are actually based on the questions that you all have been sending to us and the request for information at the last meeting. They will be a review of the employee hours tax revenue assumptions, a summary of taxes paid by businesses operating in Seattle and other jurisdictions, and then a summary of city spending related to affordable housing and homelessness services. We'll then have an open discussion of takeaways from the policy briefs, and then we'll move into review and approval of the letter that was crafted between last meeting and this meeting that we intend to send to one table. And then we'll wrap up by discussing next steps, followed up by public comment. Shannon, it's not clear for me from my, are we supposed to hear from updates from Caucus now or later?
Now.
Okay, great. So I believe the two caucuses met in between our last meeting and this one and tackled some business, and I'm expecting that we will hear from the co-chairs of both of those caucuses. Great. One eye and midway each way. First one gets first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The considerations for use of revenue, so we're calling this the Housing and Services Caucus. We met and had a really in-depth conversation about some of the considerations around the spectrum of services and the way services are provided for houseless folks in the city. We had a guest come and speak to us about the experience with the navigation team and some transitions and changes there and opportunities there. We had a really in-depth conversation about, which we're hoping to get some more information today, thank you to the central staff, about what are the considerations of how the numbers are put together right now around a level of need, and we want to make sure that there's considerations in the conversation of what it's going to look like with the acceleration of change over a decade and how that need is going to grow and shift, and we don't know how realistic it is, so we're excited to hear today to have an idea of what levels we need to build up to and beyond so that we don't find ourselves in this deficit again in the near future. We also talked about that we want to make sure that as many barriers as possible are removed through considerations on the spending side so that we have the options that most folks who find themselves on the cusp or currently experiencing houselessness actually are able to find themselves transitioning through the different types of shelter and services to find themselves in a permanent, sustainable housing situation. We also had some inquiries about at what scale of housing. So we had conversations about microhousing, rapid rehousing, housing voucher programs, and considerations of different combinations of those solutions and how that'll impact how much revenue is needed. So really a broad conversation about the context that we need to have in consideration for considering the need side. One of the things we really came away from is a consideration right now. We have a consideration that there are a lot of estimates that about 20,000 units are needed currently, with an estimate of about $160,000 per unit to build in all the needs around each of those units. We're talking about a $32 billion potential expenditure over time. And so, or is that right, 32 million or billion? 3.2 billion. There we go, over 10 years. And so, yeah, so with a consideration of 20,000 units and 160,000 per unit, that's a $3.2 billion expenditure, which if you consider that over 10 years, brings you to, and this is where I got confused, $32 million a year potentially to actually build at the rate of displacement currently. So that was, I think, sobering for us to sit and consider sort of the scale of the problem. And so we wanted to share that with this body just to give folks that's just one of many intersecting pieces we discussed around what the need is here. So, but we just wanted to sort of ground ourselves that we're talking about some pretty big numbers. And we think our city is in a good position to actually solve the problem.
Thank you, Kirsten. And do we have a presentation as well from the second caucus that's focused on the revenue generation side? None? Okay, great. So let's move right in. I need a mics. Right, thank you. Shannon just reminded me that the sign-up sheet for public comment is down at the end of the table. If folks wish to sign in, they're welcome to do so. And we'll be
taking public comment at the end of the meeting.
So we'll move right into policy briefs from Council Central staff. And the first one is a presentation of the employee hours tax revenue assumptions from Eric Sun.
Thank you. He's going to be.
You want that mic from the or you
I have a.
Can I say something about the revenue side of things? So the revenue caucus has not met since the last meeting, which is why we don't really have an extensive report. Some scheduling glitches, but we are going to meet next Friday for a more in-depth discussion. But there was some discussion over email. You know, nothing in particular to report, but we had some discussion about potential variations on the hours tax and other progressive revenue sources. And, you know, I know that I submitted some other potential taxes for central staff to look into. I'm not sure if others did.
Thank you, Jake.
So am I on now?
Yes, you're on.
Hi. I guess we don't. There's no audible cue that this is working. I just assume it's working. Okay. It's kind of unnerving. Hi. I'm Eric Sund of the Council Central staff, as I said earlier, and I've got a couple of documents to kind of walk you through. The first of which is illustrating how we might and in fact have gone about last fall and also earlier in various council deliberations estimating the revenues that might be raised by an employee hours tax, as that was sort of the tax that led to the discussion that led to the formation of this group. Including discussion of some of the limitations on the data that we have available to us to make those estimates, and some examples of what we might actually be looking at in terms of revenue with that kind of a tax, should the city impose one. And so I'll direct your attention, I don't know that it's really very easy to see up on the screen, to a handout that says Progressive Revenue Task Force, City Employee Hours Tax, Examples of Potential Revenues Raised. And when that gets to you, that'll be the thing you'll want to look at as I'll try to describe what I'm talking about for those that don't have a document just yet. So the core components of looking at the revenue that might be raised by an employee hours tax are kind of simple in structure. And one is how many employees, and the other is what is the rate. The starting point for an estimate, therefore, is how many employees, or in the case of the proposals that have been discussed in the past by the City Council, or in fact collected by the city, how many full-time equivalent employees, which is simply the number of employees adjusted by an estimate or a measurement of the extent to which they're deemed to be working full-time or part-time. And for that, we have the most recent data that we have are 2015 estimate from the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is a position count, not a full-time equivalency or FTE count. We make adjustments to that for a number of factors, including removing public sector positions that would not be subject to the tax. That's government positions. And also to remove those positions that are not covered by unemployment insurance. And basically that's removing contractors, self-employed, I guess corporate officers who are sitting on a board, and a number of other categories that are, in some cases, many cases, maybe wouldn't be considered an employee in the conventional sense. After making both of those adjustments, then the final adjustment that we put in place is based on the average number of hours, basically, for a position in the city, and that has historically been fairly stable at about 80% of full-time being the average overall. And so that brings us to a 2015 estimate, which is obviously a little out of date, but of a little shy of 450,000 FTEs. So that is effectively the maximum and the basic starting potential tax base for an employee hours tax. We've also in the past had a discussion of a number of potential exemptions or thresholds at which the tax might apply. you're all, I'm sure, creative people and could come up with other possibilities, but the ones that we've had some fairly detailed discussion about to date have mostly focused on the gross receipts of the business as an indicator of business size, which raises some potential policy questions and limitations, but it is certainly a measurement, one that can be used and one that has been used. The data for this are a little bit difficult, primarily because we don't collect at this point in time. The city does not collect a tax that takes into account both the number of FTEs and the size of the business. So we've had to look back to a point in time in which we had both factors available for consideration. And that was during the previous incarnation of an employee hours tax that was collected by the city for transportation purposes. We look back to 2009, and we're able to look at the share of that employee hours tax, or the revenue from that tax, rather, that came from businesses above certain levels of gross receipts when they were also paying the city's B&O, or gross receipts tax. And so that Roman numeral 2, examples of exemptions, just shows basically the amount of that FTE tax base that's shown under Roman numeral 1 that remains if you exempt businesses above certain, or rather businesses below a certain level of gross receipts, in this case $5, $8, and $10 million per year. You can use different numbers. These are the numbers that we had available to show you. And as you can see, they swing broadly around the 50% range for any of those three thresholds. So if you were to choose a different factor to create some kind of an exemption, the math essentially works the same for determining the impact on revenues collected. But so if you were to use something other than gross receipts, but it were still to remove half of the employee base from the tax, then you would get the same impact as, roughly speaking, as exempting businesses with less than $8 million of gross receipts per year. So moving down to item 3.
Can we ask a clarifying question? Can that, when we were having our conversation, we were reviewing some of the exemptions already within B&O tax law. Is it true to assume that those types of businesses that are already exempt from having to report in B&O, if we use B&O as a mechanism, would also be exempt from this tax?
That would certainly be administratively less complex than doing something else, but it would it would depend on how you, within certain limitations, and I couldn't probably give you the comprehensive list of every possible thing that could or could not be done for a variety of reasons, or would be difficult or easy to do for a variety of reasons. But yes, broadly speaking, that would be easier and possible.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that there is an addition to these exemptions, those who are already exempted because they're exempted from B&O tax. Then.
But those exemptions, Kirsten, are those exemptions based on characteristics of a business, or are they exemptions that have a different rate for different business sizes?
We were looking actually at the list of businesses that are exempt because of the type, structure, and sometimes different configurations of tax statuses that actually exempt them from having to report and be part of the B&O system. So therefore, we were just trying to wrap our mind around if that meant if we used B&O gross as the mechanism for the tax, would we assume that those businesses are also exempt?
I only asked the question because, as we've discussed before, is if we try to replicate a different size tax depending on the different size of business, then we're beginning to look like a B&O tax, and we're pretty much at our state mandated cap for the B&O tax. So we don't want to do something that looks like another B&O tax. Thank you.
Katie. Oh.
Well, just to follow up on that, so if that's then sort of a policy decision whether businesses that are exempted by type of the B&O tax can also be exempted from this, is that something we can get more information on, like what the revenue tax of that might be?
I think to a certain extent we have to go back and look at exactly how the comparison worked, in particular if it's being implemented in concert with another kind of exemption. If the more factors there are, then I think the more difficult it becomes to figure out how to piece together past data to produce a better estimate. And you can just, do you want to lean close?
I'm Dan Eater with staff. My understanding of the D&O tax is that there are very few businesses themselves that are exempt. It's the taxable income that has exemptions. So for instance, businesses with under $100,000 of any type that is categorically exempt. Certain kinds of nonprofit income, but not nonprofits themselves, are exempt. So just wanted to have that clarification.
As an example, fraternal and beneficiary organizations of certain kinds are exempt, but like a nonprofit's, the amounts that are derived by a nonprofit organization through the provision of childcare services or referral services are exempt, but that does not necessarily mean that the organization itself is wholly exempt. And so, but this basic framework is still there if you choose to use the same, pattern of exemption. Then it's conceivable that the city could figure out a way to prorate positions based on revenue for nonprofit organizations. It's really a question of how complicated you're willing to make the tax. Moving on to the kind of bottom line projections, under Roman numeral 3, there's not all that much that I can add. You can see the numbers in front of you. These are just examples. These three revenue estimates are, under that set of boxes are without any exemptions beyond those that are noted up, such as for government employees and so forth. And again, they're subject to the limitations of the source data, including the date of the data. And they all assume 100% compliance and no change in employment behavior and all sorts of other things like that. But you get a sense of the scale. You can see that with a $100 per FTE per year tax rate and no major additional exemptions, we'd be looking at approximately $45 million of revenue per year, we believe. And then down below under Roman numeral 4, this is the same math, but starting to apply some of the factors from the example exemptions, which are based on gross receipts that were shown under item 2. And it just shows how, as the more FTEs are exempt for whatever reason, then the less your collections at any given rate of tax.
Would it be possible for you to extend that to higher numbers, 10, 15, 20, that kind of thing?
Millions? Yeah, not at the moment. We can certainly start requesting the appropriate data. Have any particular requests? I heard 12, 15.
Take 15, 20, 25.
All right. So we don't necessarily have the comprehensive data in hand currently. So I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but I will try to look into that.
And I have a question about the numbers, the percentages up under Roman number 2. Is this the result of information that we did not have during the budget discussions? Because my recollection is that when we were talking about an EHT on businesses with gross receipts of $10 million a year, we were under the assumption that the number of the percentage of businesses that would have to pay that tax was significantly smaller than the percentage here.
Very good question, and I apologize for any confusion here. This is showing the percentage of revenue that paid by, or rather was paid in 2009 by businesses below that level. So that is based on the number of employees, not the number of businesses. So the businesses with the larger gross receipts tend to have a larger number of employees, but yeah, even.
So this is number of employees?
Or it's not quite number of employees, although it's related to that. So the 2009 tax was a transportation tax, and it had some exemptions for mode of transportation. I don't recall the specific details of that, but it meant that some employees were not subject to the tax because of how they got to work. That hasn't been a part of the discussion in more recent years, and so there's some variation there. But this is generally meant to show the impact on revenue coming in from the businesses, and so the larger businesses would presumably have more employees. But for example, it would not be half of all businesses that have a gross receipts of $8 million a year or more. It's half of the employee tax base under this kind of a model.
And as it relates to percentage, like numbers of businesses, I thought the number that we were working with for the $10 million threshold was around 10%?
Something.
All right. Okay, thank you. Questions, Daniel?
So how possible is it to look at alternatives to the implementation of this kind of a tax? So rather than doing exemption levels based on gross receipts, you do it based on number of employees, for example, or graduated rates. You know, $50 for the first 20 employees and $75 for the next 100 and $100 beyond that, something like that.
The more complicated it is, the harder it is to give you good numbers. But it is definitely possible to use to have an exemption or a tiering that is based on something other than gross receipts. I'm looking at this is position data from a different source with different modifications. It's kind of an apples to orange comparison, but in 2014, also a different year, it looks like if you were to exclude businesses with fewer than, 100 or fewer employees, that would exclude about 55% of the base. So that would be something like using this $5 million gross receipts threshold in terms of impact on revenue. We can use different factors. It really just becomes a question of how accurately can we determine how much of the tax base is exempted under any given criterion.
And just to clarify, Daniel, you're asking about a different way to exempt businesses according to number of employees. You're not suggesting a different tax rate depending on the number of employees that a business has.
I was actually thinking about if that would be a fairer way or a better way to look at doing this, of having the first portion of employees in a company, or not portion, but the first number of employees in a company taxed at a lower rate, and then as businesses are larger and have more employees, the rate actually goes up for those later employees.
And that's what I keep coming back to about the B&O tax cap. That starts to look like B&O tax.
I thought it was the opposite, because I thought the B&O was really related to just these gross receipts issues, so I thought maybe this is a different way to get at that.
One of the other problems that I wanted to just surface here is, as Eric mentioned, the kind of assumptions we're making about how much money would flow from an employee hours tax is based on pretty stale data. This is the last time the city had data on both how much gross receipts a business brought in a given year and how many employees, full-time equivalent employees, were working for that same employer was 2009. So that's a good long while ago, and the economy has changed quite a bit since 2009. We are willing and able to make a gross level estimate for essentially one cut of that data. But as you start to tier more and more complexity, our confidence in the ability to determine how much money is going to flow really starts to fall off.
Before we lose the thought, before I lose the thought, can you speak to the question of, we know that a tiered structure based on gross revenue looks, it feels like a B&O tax. Does a tiered structure based on numbers of employees also do that, or is that something that's
less so, I think.
Less so?
I can't tell you that one of them is 70% like and the other one's 40% like.
That was my proposal during budget that you and Tony kiboshed. Pretty sure, but
where we do potentially have a challenge, depending on what other factors you might want to consider in terms of which businesses would be subject to the tax is the availability of data by business size and those other factors. It's like the more different layers are being added, then the more. I'm not saying that we can't find it, but I don't know the universe of possible combinations for which we can give you a relatively accurate estimate.
Let's put a pin in it and do a little bit more research, though. I think it's a good idea to flesh out some more.
Just questions on where the data's just a question on where the data's from. So who collects the number of employees or the number of FTEs?
The Department of Labor and Industries, Employment Security, and the Employment Security Department, both state agencies collect some employment-related data. The earlier data that we had from 2009 was collected by the city when the city had reason to collect it because it was collecting a tax on which the base was employees, and happened to also be collecting, as it currently does, a gross receipts tax on the same businesses, more or less. So there are multiple data sets out there, and they don't all necessarily use the same definitions and exclusions and so forth. So this is where, speaking to the, we will obviously try our best, but we don't directly collect the data, and we don't have an opportunity to look back and have them collected a different way, and some of them don't fit together clean.
They also have the data on the number of, that does sound better, on the number of hours worked by employee, or like the FTE equivalent versus the number of employees?
Some of the data sets, I believe, have that, some do not.
Okay, thanks.
Lisa.
I was wondering what is either known or knowable about the proportion of the workforce that is in the either nonprofit sector or the human services subsector of the nonprofit sector.
I don't know. I suspect it is more likely possible to figure out what proportion of employees are working for a nonprofit than it is to figure out what proportion of employees are working for a particular kind of nonprofit. But I don't really know how likely we are to be successful with either, with a reasonable degree of accuracy.
Kirsten.
Shortcut, thank you. I think, the thing I'm hyper aware of in a lot of these estimates, and that you prefaced all of this with in the overview, is that we're in a very different time economically with the number of businesses, the number of employees, and that in our city in this moment than we were even 7 years ago in 2009. One thing we were talking about at our caucus meeting was that the scale of this problem is such that we would feel like we're undercutting any progress we can make if we aren't at least considering a 5 to 10 year revenue solution and what it is to build inventory over that time. It's just such a large problem at this scale. I'm assuming the answer is it would be hard to know or it is unknown, but the other consideration I think we have is how do we make sure that we have some sort of revenue source that is not unduly impacted by any large turn in the economy that actually then undercuts the revenue stream, and therefore the domino effect is you're undercutting the types of services and housing and what's able to be provided. And especially because we know even in a boom, am I too loud? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I can't hear myself, I apologize, I was screaming at the people. So with that, because we have, of course, this double thing of if the economy turns, actually the need will actually increase, not decrease as far as what needs to be spent. So we were really trying to wrap our minds around what's a progressive revenue solution that we also know is sustainable despite other economic impacts. And I don't know that there is an option, but we wanted to hear if there are options.
I don't want to force my definition of progressive on the other. I think there are probably many strong opinions here on that matter, but most business-specific taxes are going to fluctuate to some degree, and in some cases to a relatively large degree, with economic conditions, and that's the nature employment will tend to decline in a downturn, revenues will tend to decline in a downturn, income, which, just to name something that is taxed elsewhere, it will tend to decline in a downturn. Some taxes that are not business specific that are, but are nonetheless paid by businesses, in many cases, or at least indirectly, property tax tend to be more stable, but I don't, again, I'm not here to opine on the progressive question in that sense, but there are taxes that fluctuate less, and I don't feel qualified to give everyone a particularly quantified comparison of the relative stability of each of them, but business activity is notably influenced by economic cycles.
One question I have about these assumptions is understanding that these 2009 numbers are very dated, and understanding that we're interested in sort of knowing sort of what the range is, while also realizing that there is a lack of specificity or lack of certainty around the data. Is there a reason why we would not, again, so we could have a range of what the possible revenue might be? Is there a reason why we would not, since this is based on employee number count, we would not apply our employment growth assumptions to these numbers?
No, that is a sensible thing. I would say that our data are not entirely quite as old as that, in that we used 2009 because that was the last year that the two taxes, the prior EHT, employee hours tax, and the business occupation tax were both collected at the same time, which is what we needed. And we used that to generate the estimate of how much revenue would be lost by making exemptions based on residencies. But the starting point, the number of FTEs we're using as the starting point if you have no exemptions, is from 2015, which I grant you is still not current, but it is at least less outdated.
Okay, that's helpful. Good to know. All right. Any other questions on this presentation before we move on to the next? Great. Let's move on to the summary of taxes paid by businesses operating in Seattle and other jurisdictions.
I think that's been handed out as well. The other table that I'll speak to you about today is, I would say it certainly isn't capturing every possibility. It isn't even coming close to it. It is an attempt to show some examples of hypothetical businesses with given levels of gross receipts, because that has been a discussion, and because that is the base for the city's current business-specific tax, as well as number of employees, and to show both what we would estimate these hypothetical businesses would pay in Seattle business taxes, business-specific taxes that is, this year at current rates, how that might be impacted by an example of an employee hours tax, in this case $100 per FTE per year, EHT with no major gross receipts or FTE-based exemptions, and then to show some, again, examples, not every possible example, of what a business of those characteristics might pay in business-specific taxes in some other locations. And just some general caveats. The East Side businesses, or the King County businesses that are shown here, there are 5 of them, and they were selected partly because I'd already looked into these at specific requests previously, but also because making a comparison, to the extent that you're interested in doing so, is much easier when you hold the other variables constant. So if we know that another city in King County is under the same county tax and legal framework, it is under the same state tax and legal framework. So it makes it, while there are other factors, economic factors, social factors that make for differences, this is closer from a monetary standpoint to an apples-to-apples comparison. We also had some requests to look at other cities outside the Puget Sound region. I have only 2 examples here. I will say that even with these that it is very difficult to make, I think, a direct comparison. These are merely information points, because because these, again, have different, jurisdictions in other places not only don't necessarily have the same kinds of taxes, they don't necessarily apply the ones that look the same in the same way. In addition, they may have different jurisdictional divides in terms of services that are provided or where revenue goes. For example, a county may provide a service somewhere where here we provide it at the city level. Or a state may preclude something from being done, or it may collect taxes and redistribute some of them at the local level for different purposes. So I think it's very difficult to make a tidy comparison to what might happen elsewhere. But having said that, I'll just walk through briefly so you hopefully understand what I was trying to do here. Again, on the first column, I'm just showing, because many taxes, including the city's own B&O tax, depend in part on what kind of business activity you're engaged in. And I assumed here that each business does only one thing, which I think is not typical, but makes it a lot easier to show some examples. So, for example, a retail service company here is assumed to do nothing but, to receive income rather from nothing but retail services. Again, there's an assumption for just a number that's chosen at a variety of levels for gross receipts annually and number of employees measured by full-time equivalents, FTEs. The column that has the little A above it in parentheses is capturing what that hypothetical business would pay in the city's 2 current business-specific taxes. Certainly. And the first of those is the business license tax certificate fee, and it is the smaller revenue source that is specific to businesses, but it comes first in my mind because it is the fee that you pay to get the certificate that licenses your business. It's your registration fee, basically. And the second is the business license tax, more commonly known as the B&O tax or the gross receipts tax. And so this is showing, given those gross receipt and business categories, what the city would be collecting in 2018 from those 2 sources. Column B shows what a simple, relatively straightforward $100 per FTE per year employee hours tax would add, and then the column that follows, column C, is the sum of those 2. So it's showing if we had already imposed such a tax, what we think that is the hypothetical business in the given row would pay with that tax added on. In the following columns, you can see what other cities might be collecting, again in business-specific taxes. Try to remember here exactly what's going on in each of these. City of Bellevue has a gross receipts business tax as well as a license fee. The city of Renton previously had an FTE tax for certain categories of business, but has moved away from that and has a gross receipts tax. Redmond and Kirkland both rely on an employee hours type tax, an FTE tax, for their that is their primary business tax. And the city of Bothell has a sort of complicated multi-factor element that involves looking at the number of FTEs and the category of business and also the square footage of business space that is within the city. And in any case, attempted to be as accurate as possible in capturing what the given business would pay in these different jurisdictions. Atlanta and San Diego are obviously out-of-state examples. Atlanta uses both a gross receipts tax and an FTE tax, and San Diego has an FTE-based tax for employees after 12 FTEs. I wouldn't not want to portray this as capturing every possible outcome. There are many cities out there that rely primarily on non-business specific taxes that are collected on business, and I would also note that the city of Seattle collects taxes, and the state of Washington and King County collect taxes from businesses that are not business specific, for example, property tax.
Which are not represented.
They are not. They are not. I've not attempted to capture the entire range of things they might be subject to. Frankly, just because it got too complicated once I started to think, all right, well, what kind of sales tax activity or use tax activity would they have, and what value of property would a business with this?
Any other folks? One other item, I mean, I think this is just getting back to what you've been saying as well, is that, you know, when you look at Georgia and San Diego, Georgia and San Diego, California, both of those states have state income taxes. So that's an example of a tax that businesses pay. It's not specifically levied on businesses, but I'd hazard a guess that if we were to factor that in, the numbers would look significantly different. Tony.
Yes, similar. I had a question with a similar point. Is what is the correlation between column A and the out of the Seattle numbers? Because it doesn't appear to me that they correlate. Maybe they do for the King County cities. Are those the similar? Do those tax revenues reflect the same as what's reflected in Seattle for column A?
To some extent. These cities don't necessarily collect, even in King County, don't necessarily collect the same kinds of taxes. So again, Redmond and Kirkland, you have basically an employee hours tax, but they levy it at a rate that is lower than what's been discussed to date on the council side. Bellevue has a gross receipts tax, but the structure of that gross receipts tax is different. But they're the much closer comparisons in the sense that we know that the state isn't, or the county, or the cities themselves are not collecting a business income, a corporate income tax in Bellevue or Renton or Redmond or Kirkland because they're under the same legal framework.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Can I just ask a clarifying question on that? Just because I don't think I understood the answer.
We'll have this one go. Oh, we've got Mike up next.
Here's how I'll try to ask the question. So if I took took a business, let's say the third column, and was currently being taxed at $23,350 in Seattle, and I moved it to Bellevue, could I expect to pay only $7,565 in taxes? Is that captured
in business-specific taxes?
Business-specific. Right. Is there something on the other side that's not being counted?
Well, I don't believe Bellevue and Seattle, for example, have the same property tax levy, so there would be some kind of difference there. The property value might be different, and so that's another factor. So I wouldn't say that it's as simple as saying, well, you're going to have a lower tax, but the B&O, the gross receipts tax collected by the city of Bellevue is at a lower rate than the city of Seattle's, either of the city of Seattle's gross receipts tax rates, and so you would pay less under that circumstance.
And if you could work the mic around to Maiko, she has a question as well.
So, Eric, quick question. I'm probably not holding this right. The other jurisdictions also utilize things like the limited improvement districts for neighborhood improvement and business improvement areas and those types of taxes?
I wouldn't pretend that I know exactly how prevalent those are in each of these particular jurisdictions, but those are things, and they're out there.
That maybe other places don't use. And I cannot remember I'm pretty sure I know what the minimum wage is here between A, B, C, and D business classes. What's the minimum wages like in the other Seattle or the other Puget Sound area jurisdictions?
I don't recall any of these cities having, I may just be wrong about this, so I want to really put a flag here. I do not recall any of these cities enacting a municipal, yeah, so they would have the state minimum wage, which I don't.
Right now it's
$11.50.
I believe it's $11.50 as of January 1.
So $11.50 at the state, and I think in the city, if you're in classification D for a business, it's about $11.50. Is that right?
It tracks with the smallest Seattle.
So the top tier is actually above 15 now. It's, I think, 1550, 1575 is the top tier. 75 is the top tier. Yeah, that's right.
And there are other business expenses, of course, that could vary from place to place that are not within the control of the jurisdictions.
Kirsten. We have this problem with this mic now.
Close it back to you.
All right.
I mean, thank you for this, and I appreciate how hard it is to really compare apples to apples because we don't have a flat model anywhere. But in consideration of the Washington, King County specific comparisons. I mean, what I'm seeing here when you're talking about that some of these cities already do have an employee hours tax format built in, and these are the thresholds. For me, when I look at this dispels this myth that I have heard over and over again that I think is caught up in a much bigger myth just about whether or not taxes are a good idea. That somehow any implementation of dollars that are contributed towards the public good, that people just abandon those places and flock to other places. If that were the case with the changes that we're seeing between some very close municipalities to Seattle, quite frankly, we would not have the boom and types of businesses that we have in our city. So for me, this just dispels this myth that somehow it's a tax threshold that is the end-all be-all of how people make decisions about where their businesses are, who they serve, and the structure of their businesses. So this is, I think, helpful for me to dispel that myth, and I would just invite us to just remove what I think is really just a sort of propaganda harped up idea about that's wrapped up in the same thing as trickle-down economics or these other things that are things we say that aren't actually about how we know economics functions.
I don't think I have
that doesn't need a response necessarily.
It's just an observation.
No, it's helpful. Do we have other questions about this particular presentation? I think that was a helpful segue. If people are ready to segue to the third presentation, which moving over to the spending and needs side of the equation, we've got Tracy and Tracy Westliff.
All right, is the presentation up? Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm Alan Lee with Council Central Staff, and I'm going to kick things off. In your agenda, it states that this is a presentation on spending, but we're actually going to provide some a brief framing on needs in regards to homelessness and affordable housing. So we're going to start off with the annual homeless count numbers for the past 5 years, from 2013 to 2017. And just for those who don't know, our local jurisdictions around the country, they conduct an annual night count. They do this each year. It's a requirement by HUD for federal funding. Unsurprisingly, as we are all aware, homelessness has been on the rise in this area for years now. You'll see in 2013 in the final column, the total number of homelessness counted was around 9,000. Last year, the total was around 11,600. So there has been a substantial increase in the number of homelessness in this area. This is for all of King County. And you'll see a substantial increase in the first column that is unsheltered homeless. So unsheltered homeless has increased from 3,400 to about 5,500 last year. Unsheltered homeless being those who are in tents, in vehicles, or out on the street. So what do we know about this population? So what do we know about this population if we look at the numbers from last year? And so actually, before I go into that, I'll just briefly state that there was a change in methodology to the count last year. And so the numbers, if you look at them from 2013 to 2017, methodologically, statistically speaking, they're not strictly comparable, but the trend is obvious. So anyway, with that preface, we know that the majority of those counted are in the Seattle area. So 73% of those counted in the King County area were counted in the Seattle area. So that, and for 2017, it was almost 4,000 unsheltered and about 4,600 sheltered. We also know that this disproportionately impacts people of color. So Black or African Americans comprised 29% of those counted in King County. And American Indians, Native Alaskans accounted for 6% of those counted in King County. And that's despite Black African Americans being only 6% of the population, and American Indians, Native Alaskans being less than 1% of the population. Of course, we know a lot more about this population, and that's all contained in the one-night count report. I point these two out specifically because they feature importantly in the city's new strategy for its homelessness investments, Pathways Home, which I'll talk about in a few slides. What else do we know? We know that 24% of those counted in King County are considered chronically homeless. So the official definition of chronic homelessness is an unaccompanied adult who has been homeless continuously for over a year, or an unaccompanied adult who has had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. So that's a federal definition.
And disabled. Disability.
I'm sorry, was there a question?
And disability is part of that definition.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thanks for the reminder, Dan.
Could you clarify
The federal definition of chronic homelessness is not only the duration, as Alan pointed out, but also that the person has a disability.
Yes, and a disabling condition that can include a mental, physical disability. It can also include a diagnosable addiction disorder, and it can also include. There's a 4th item that I think I'm missing, but anyway, I'm going to pass this over to Tracy.
So moving to the next slide, so another source of data that indicates need for affordable housing for populations that we consider most at risk of homelessness, and what I mean by that are folks who have incomes at or below 30% of area median income, are those households that are severely cost burdened. And what I mean by that is that these are renter households that are paying more than 50% of their income for rent and utilities. So as the slide indicates, of the total renter households in the city of 156,000 households, 22,800 or nearly 23,000 households are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. That's a significant number, and it really has not changed too much over the last couple of data sets that we looked at in terms of kind of the absolute number. The information is information we get from the American Community Survey. Unfortunately, the data there is 2010 to 2014 data, and as much as that surprises me that we can't get more current data, that is the way that the information is passed on to jurisdictions. We got this data just in May of this year, or 2017, so this is the most current data we have in terms of housing burden.
And could you give me a context? What percentage of residents in Seattle are considered renters? What is that percentage?
I think it's about half and half.
Okay.
It may be a little actually over 50%.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're going to get into the spending here. So this slide shows the last 3 years, including the current year, for the city's investments in homelessness. These are located in the Human Services Department's HSI division, the Homelessness Strategies and Investments division, where most of the contracts for homelessness services reside. And you'll see from 2015 to 2018, it indicates how much of those funds come from the general fund, the city's general fund, and how much comes from other sources, those being federal, state, county, other fund sources. And you'll see a steady increase in that budget from 2015 to 2018. 2015, as a reminder, is when the city, as well as the county, declared a state of emergency and provided $7 million in one-time funds. The state of emergency was declared in November in response to the increase in the homelessness population, and in particular to the number of deaths that occurred that year. And ever since 2015, the funding has increased steadily each year. Okay, so this next slide shows the city's investments managed by the HSI division by intervention type. So these are the major homelessness intervention types whose outcomes are aimed towards exiting people to permanent housing. So this is for 3 years, from 2016 to this year, and I'm sure many people here know with the change the city underwent with its strategy with Pathways Home, that culminated in a RFP in 2017, reinvesting the city's homelessness contracts, recompeting them for the first time in over 10 years. So Pathways Home, it's a broad policy shift in the city's approach for investments, but in very brief, it essentially entails looking at performance management, focusing on exits to permanent housing, and really shifting, resulting in a shift in the city's resources into particular types of interventions. So I would just point out the shift in diversion, the first row, also prevention, which is the fifth row. I apologize, I know this is kind of small. Prevention, the fifth row, and then also rapid rehousing in the following row, that there were shifts in funding resulting from the RFP. Also noting that in emergency services, there are new interventions that were spearheaded as a result of the state of emergency, including authorized encampments. Those are contained in emergency services, and also that a part of the Pathways Home strategy also involves converting shelters to low barrier enhanced shelter. So that was also a major shift in investments. So I'll also point out that, as I said before, this slide represents the investments that are aimed at exits to permanent housing. So this doesn't actually capture all of the city's investments for services that may serve homeless and other capacities. So for example, I'll pick on Lisa Dugard because she's sitting right there.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? So law enforcement assisted diversion, for example, many of the participants in that program are homeless. Approximately 70 to 80% of the participants are homeless, but it's not a homelessness program. Can I say that, Lisa? Also, I see the sticker on her laptop supporting safe consumption sites. So City Council provided $1.7 million for a safe consumption site this year. So that's something that's also not explicitly a homelessness program, but will undoubtedly serve homeless population. We also have investments in education, serving youth with their education needs, homeless youth with their education needs, for example. Those are not reflected here. We have public health investments, so methadone clinic, food programs. So those are not reflected here. What is reflected here are contracts that are focused on permanent housing exits.
Questions?
Yeah.
Work the mic down.
Can I ask how this relates to what Kirsten said about $160,000 to get one person into permanent housing? Is that basically, is all that captured in that number?
I need to ask you, was that the cost of the actual housing units, or was it services and housing, or was it services? I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah. So reviewing the numbers, I just wanted to clarify, this is based on some different estimates, and I want to be clear here as well, and I don't think folks are, I'm looking back at a Puget Sound estimate that a combination of, in the Puget Sound area, services, housing, crisis infrastructure, that altogether, there's estimates well over $1 billion that are being spent in the Puget Sound area. We know people's definition of Puget Sound, regional, these are all terms and these numbers are coming from different places. But those estimates really were based on just building the infrastructure, not around the wraparound services. And that's the thing we wanted to clarify. And a clarification on the number was $3.2 billion, which for a 10-year estimate of building that inventory, and that's if the numbers don't increase over that time, right? This is a number that's set at what the current deficit is in units needed to rebalance housing infrastructure. That's actually $320 million a year when I went back and looked at the number. So big numbers for an inventory with an assumption that somehow the crisis plateaus and we're just addressing, and that housing is the only issue. And we know one of the reasons we have some great success in our region is we don't just look at whether you have four walls as the crux of the issue, that there's a wraparound service provision built into the numbers. So when we looked at just the inventory number and then we were like, now we have to add this and this and this, we knew we're talking about some pretty large numbers over time.
So to get back to your question, this does not, except for the last row there, you see in 2018, there's $400,000 for capital. So other than that, this largely does not involve capital dollars.
Okay.
Ian.
The number seems low from what I've read. So the $160,000 per unit, does that include the acquisition of the land or just the construction cost of the unit?
Some folks who do some building here.
Katie has some information to share. Two mics.
Running mics.
Okay, so let me try to explain a little bit the numbers that Kirsten's been talking about, because this came up in our discussion and I was the one who put them forward. So first of all, the numbers that we're talking about for the need, and I think what Kirsten said was 20,000 units over the next 10 years. So that comes from an estimate from the Housing Development Consortium of the quote-unquote housing gap. So they estimated that in 2016, there was a gap of over 17,000 units for households in the 0 to 30% AMI range, sort of missing. And it would be helpful, I don't know exactly how they get those numbers, so that would be helpful to know. But then they said that that gap by 2030 is going to be 27,000 or over 27,000 units. So that's sort of what we need to create by 2030 in order to have enough housing for people in the 0 to 30% AMI range. So then, we looked at what is going to be created optimistically if all of the HALA recommendations are put into effect, and that's around 6,000 units. So we're left with a gap of 20,000 plus units. So that's where that number comes from. And again, I don't know all the ins and outs of how they did that calculation, so that would be good to know. And what's in here about the severely rent burdened households is really useful as well. So one way or another, it's not going to be an exact science, but coming up with some estimate of what the need is, I think, is really important. On the numbers, $160,000 per unit, so that's just a capital cost estimate. My understanding is that right now, the city, for the affordable housing units that they're creating, are using around $90,000 a unit, and that's not the total cost of construction. Like Ian was just saying, that's just the city's portion, and then that's assuming that there's other streams of funding that are, matching that or augmenting it. But the reason why we're using the $160,000 is, it's my understanding that some of the streams of funding which are subsidizing units currently, if we scale up, those are not going to all be available. So the city would have to actually come up with a larger percentage of the capital cost of each unit in order to build it. So, and that number specifically came from Councilmember Sawant's office, and I think they've talked with the Office of Housing about that. So that's where that comes from. And so that's how we're coming up with $3.2 billion over 10 years to build those units.
Said a different way, Katie, what you're saying is if we are talking about massively boosting our production, we can't expect the same match that we get from other jurisdictions and other fund sources.
Exactly, yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Is there a revenue side to this as well, besides the increased taxing? But the residents of the new units are going to be paying something in rent, I assume. So is that part of the math?
I lost my mic.
Sorry.
Perhaps you can answer this question. So again, this is just the capital cost of constructing the units. So then after the unit is built, then there's the question of, if this is permanent supportive housing, how much does it cost for, wraparound services? If it's just housing, how much of the, rent that's paid is covering the costs, or are there ongoing costs? So that's a separate question that we're not even considering. So yeah.
Alan, you have something to say to that? Or because we got another question?
I have one, yeah, I do. So what I was saying about, just to clarify, what I said about capital on this table here, the 400,000. So that's actually not housing, it's for shelter. It's for the interventions listed here. It's not actually for housing.
Question for, I think it's Tracy. Tracy, you looked at the number of severely cost-burdened renter households with incomes below 30% of AMI. Yep. I think somebody making minimum wage makes above 30% of AMI. And so I'm wondering, do you know what the percentage of SCB renter households are with incomes at 50% or just severely cost-burdened households?
Sure. So the number for people from 30 to 50% of median income who are severely cost burdened is 6,475.
So what percentage of that? No, okay, don't worry about that.
Thank you.
I guess my other question.
I'll get that to you. I don't do well with percentages.
Can I ask my question about a slide that's coming up? Just because I'm curious is, so you're going to be showing this, the capital funding commitments?
Correct.
What percentage, it kind of gets to the questions that were raised, so what percentage of the cost of building a new unit does the city of Seattle typically kick in? And then,
Michael, you are taking my thunder.
I'm just asking.
I know.
You know these questions are coming up.
I know, that's why my presentation covers that information.
Oh, does it? And then my other question is, I know that you've looked at new affordable housing units funded, and you're looking at the income level, but is there a match between unit size and type and what is needed to meet the need? So are you only building studios and ones, or are you looking at larger units? So those are my questions, so you can cut me off.
Wait.
So Tracy, did you want to respond to that now, or you want to hold one? Just
go.
I think I'm going to go ahead and do my presentation. I'm going to have to circle back with you on the.
Katie's got another
I have a backward-looking question on the stuff that we've already covered.
All right, so before we move on, let's get the questions out for what we've already covered.
So just on the more sort of shelter and services side of things, this is all really useful. There's a few gaps that I see that I think it would be good to fill to have a better grasp on the need. So one is, we have information about like money that's being spent on shelter. I think it would be useful to know like how many shelter beds there are in Seattle, and maybe with some breakdown of type. And then also how many of those are city funded. And the other big gap I see here is that, we have over 3,857 unsheltered people in Seattle. My understanding is that over 40% of those live in vehicles.
Correct.
And that, I think, is important because, when you see that number, 3,857, you think, well, let's just get all those people in shelter, but the needs of the people living in vehicles are often significantly different. And so it would also be good to know what, if anything, the city is currently doing to assist those people.
Okay, so a couple of things. So yeah, we could definitely get beds. We could ask the executive for that information. I think also it'll be important to also include contextualizing information. So one of the reasons why the city has decided to shift to enhanced shelter, for example, is that an enhanced shelter bed might be more expensive, but there's a greater, for lack of better words, utilization rate. So more people might be transitioning to permanent housing or to some other step along the continuum more efficiently with an enhanced shelter bed rather than a regular shelter bed. So it would be important to have that kind of contextualizing information as well. For different intervention types for different segments of the population, not just for people living in vehicles, but for people living on the street is different from people living in unauthorized encampments, for example. So yeah, there's a large range of different types of interventions that need to be addressed, and I could certainly try to collect some of that information, but I guess, and I won't presume to speak for the group, but I guess it would be helpful to know what particular types of information the group is interested in, and I'd encourage everybody to look at the count report, the full report with all of the details. I just included 3 pieces, I think, of data, but there's actually a wealth of data in the 2017 report in particular, because this past year they were able to conduct a survey of over 1,000 people in the homelessness system, which they had not done before, and it's actually very useful information. So I don't have the web link, but if you just Google 2017 Night Count Seattle, it'll show up.
Great, thank you. And Ashley just mentioned she'll send it out for ease of access. All right, moving on, Tracy.
Okay, so let's move on to the city's funding commitments for new affordable rental housing. So moving to the next slide, if you would. So this slide shows you what the city has done in terms of funding commitments over the last 3 years for new rental units for all income levels served, is what this slide shows. As you can see, the biggest increases in the sources of funding over the last 3 years have really been the incentive zoning, which has brought in a range of $24 million to $37 million. During our very robust development period. And then also the changeover or movement from the 2009 housing levy to the 2016 housing levy, which happened in 2017. You see the jump from the $17 million in 2016 to 2017, and that is what that reflects. It's that doubling of the housing levy. Thank you to the voters. And then the other big addition that we see in terms of resources for those 3 years was the approval of bond financing that happened in 2017. So moving to the next slide. This shows the new affordable housing units that were funded as a result of those financing commitments. First category is the permanent supportive housing units, which is actually a subset. I broke it out from the 3% of AMI housing. It does serve people under 30% of AMI. I think on average, Dan, what is it? 12% AMI, may even be lower in terms of the...
For chronic illness person?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's under 15%.
Yeah, exactly. So, so these are the units that have not only the housing unit itself, but have those intensive services that can be case management, addiction services, front desk, 24/7 front desk. So those are the kind of heavily serviced units that serve those who are most impacted by homelessness as well as disabilities associated with that. And you can see that in 2015, 2016, and 2017, we have tried to increase the number of those units that we produced. It's a challenging environment to do that, and we can talk a little bit further on here about the challenges faced by doing more of those units. Next category is the under 30% of AMI, and you can see that we increased those numbers over 2015 to 2017. And the final category is, oh, we shouldn't say 30%. Oh, yes, it should be 31%. So it's basically 31% to really 60% of AMI. We don't really go much above the 80% of AMI category in the rental housing program. We do that in the homeownership program, but pretty much it's 30 to 60%, and you see the numbers there over the last 3 years. So 2017 was a big year for us in terms of the number of units, 896 units, almost $74 million, as the last slide showed, in terms of total resources.
724 number, right? That's not, I keep looking at it.
Oh, no, it isn't right. Oh, I'm so sorry. There have been a few hands that have been on these slides. Let me just suggest to you over the last couple of days. So yes, that's a much lower number. And we can do the quick math on that. But 200, yeah. Apologies for that. Moving to the next slide.
Oh, Tracy, before you do, can you move to the two slides back?
The 2 slides back. That one?
Yeah, that one right there.
Okay.
I just want to point out that the $29 million in housing bond funds for 2017, often we see categories, returning year after year, or maybe inching up a little bit year after year, because of people decide that they want to continue with the funding source. I want to just point out that that $29 million is basically a one-time investment, and it's a one-time investment that I would like not to be one-time investment, but in order to make that happen, we need to have an ongoing, dependable revenue source in order to pay the bond back. We were able to do it this one time because of the annual financing costs were low enough that the council felt comfortable that we could absorb it within our yearly annual budgeting, but that is not something that we're going to be able to continue to do because it's compounded. If we do another $29 million, it's just that much more money that we're going to have to find to pay off 30 years worth of debt. So for me, that's why a high priority for a new revenue source is an ongoing fund source so that we can do several years worth of housing bond financing to really boost the production that the Office of Housing is making possible by funding the organizations that build housing in the city. Thanks.
That's a great reminder, and I guess I just had a question about that. Again, I'm just trying to accumulate all the things for consideration as we're getting closer to thinking through revenue numbers. Is there a certain threshold of revenue that has to be in place percentage-wise as a mechanism for a percentage of the bond for repayment terms? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
For that $29 million, I think we have to come up with about $2 million a year to pay it off.
Okay.
I think that's right, yeah. It really is depending on the size of the bond and obviously the term of that bond.
Perfect. Right.
And the rate, of course, yes, the interest rate. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. So just a word about the city's capital funding commitments. So we are, as everybody has already heard, we are only one of many funders of affordable housing projects. Our other typical fund sources that we have our nonprofits tap into is State Housing Trust Fund or state set-aside allocations. Federal funds, you saw up there, CDG Home, they've been a fairly fluctuating source of income, and we'll just see how that all plays out in the coming years here. King County also provides some resources on the capital side, and then we have other partners who have the Allen Foundation, for example, has made some significant contributions. United Way has made contributions over the years as well. Again, as we've discussed, the city's dollars typically represent approximately 30% of the total funding for permanent supportive housing and the under 30% of AMI units when other usual fund sources are available. So this is a really, really, really important concept here, folks. We modeled the 2016 housing levy and potential production based on an assumption that we would max out all of the available resources over that 7-year period. So all but perhaps one resource, and that is the 4% tax credit on the capital side. So when we talk about wanting to put more money towards capital, we're going to have to be assuming that cost is going to go up. And just to give a reference, we know that in the 2017 NOFA, the average cost per unit was about $311,000 total cost, all cost on capital side. And the city's contribution towards that on average was about $93,000. That has increased by $10,000 over the last couple of years in terms of the city's contribution. Was $73,000 approximately in 2015, and in 2017 about $93,000. And then finally, when it comes to the city making funding commitments, so the city does an annual NOPA process where housing developers submit their proposals to be considered, the city reviews those, and then makes funding commitments. Those funding commitments are commitments. Projects are in a very different phase in terms of where they are in development when they come in for their funding. There can be folks who have just acquired their site, so they have another 2 or 3 years to go before they're actually going to start turning dirt. Others come in and they are kind of at the tail end of that process, and they're ready as soon as they get their final financing commitment, which might be us, to turn dirt in 3 or 4 months, whenever they can get their building permits picked up. So those financing commitments are made in a given year, but the actual spending and then the actual construction of those units can be 1 to 3 years down the road. So just another thing for folks to think about in terms of considering the allocation of resources towards this effort.
And Tracy, I think, when we see, I don't know how many years it will take, but I think it would be interesting to see how much the injection of additional dollars that were unanticipated at the time of the development of the 2016 housing levy, how that has affected the leveraging. So there's 29 million more as a result of the 2016 housing bond decision. How did that affect the leverage amount for the total bucket of city dollars spent? I don't think you know that yet, but it's something that will be at some point knowable. And I think it'll be useful to see if it negatively affects our ability to leverage. It will to some extent, but it'd be helpful to know how much.
So I can talk to the executive about this. It's going to be a little complicated because not only do we use our housing levy resources for new construction of units, but we also are using it to go back and actually do rehab of some of our existing buildings. And I think some of that $29 million, for example, is going to be used on some significant rehab activities. And so you've got a different dynamic there in terms of the financing for those rehab that's different than for new construction. But let me go back and see if there's any way to parse out how much we were going to use that $29 million for new construction versus those rehab projects. Yeah. Questions? Okay. Moving on to the next slide.
Lisa has a question.
Well, I'm not sure if this is the right moment to ask this question, but since I have the mic, I will do it at this moment. I appreciate all of this information. It's not a critique of what we are hearing, but what I'm not seeing is kind of a cut on need and the way in which current revenue sources operate to reinforce those with greatest barriers to housing, and that is one of the mandates of this task force, is to look at solutions specifically that address those with greatest barriers, including criminal history, active substance use, and certain others. So I am not asking you to materialize extra slides, but I do want to comment. We only have a few meetings, and I feel like that is a really important missing analytic lens in the conversations that we've had to date. So just a plea that we turn to that question collectively soon.
Go ahead.
I just want to clarify. Are you asking for more information about the number of dollars that are spent on the lowest barrier interventions?
I don't think that is the way in which policy happens, right? So it isn't actually that there's intentionality around that, setting aside the navigation center and the other very small capacity, low barrier sort of transitional or emergency services strategies. At a policy level, planning to counter-program the criminal history barriers that exist in some of these funding sources, that is just not happening in a thoughtful way. And so I think us understanding what the impact of those policies over decades has been, why people with criminal history and active substance use find themselves with the least options for housing, and what we might be able to do locally to counter-program to that. So the county's VETS levy conversation is centering on that question, and I think there's a pool of analytical information we could tap into, but I really think that we need to talk about that as a group.
I actually think that we are talking about it, and I think we're talking about it on a couple of different levels. One has to do with the coordinated entry and a lot of discussion on improving that process, which does include barriers that are being put up by some housing providers, and we are trying to break that all down in terms of how we are now putting people through the coordinated entry and having
I'm just
great.
asking that we bring that into this.
Okay, it's not really tied to the financing. I don't think this is a.
I think it's a good practice for the
Yeah, it's policy. Yeah, it really is.
So yeah, in addition to coordinated entry, I know there have been changes in the housing levy A&F plan guidelines that express the expectations the city has for what kind of screening is used by agencies receiving housing levy funds. And then, of course, there's the fair chance housing legislation that nonprofits are expected to abide by as much as
yes.
So hopefully with those policy tools, that behavior is changing.
And I will say that, again, because permanent supportive housing units do typically serve those who can have those kinds of barriers, when we are creating those permanent supportive housing units, we are providing housing for those who may have the greatest barriers.
Sorry, so I want to push back just a little bit because it's not, it really is about, Tracy's point about coordinated entry is a good entry point to this discussion, which I realize we're not fully having now and hopefully we'll have next time. But I'm sitting here reading Mayor Durkin's announcement about building a bridge to housing for all, and it, as usual, engages in the prioritization of the most vulnerable, which is not the same as those with greatest barriers. And so every time we prioritize a group, we are also deprioritizing other folks who face greatest barriers. And we have to be super ultra intent. Coordinated entry has failed to address this issue for complex reasons that have to do with the self-interest of many. And if we're going to take the mandate of the task force seriously to focus on those with greatest barriers, we're going to have to be super rigorous in our own practice, I think, to examine how those barriers play out and what would have to be done to actually not just say that someone can't literally be blocked from access to a unit by a certain characteristic, but that we're not prioritizing everybody else, and then guess what happens? So that, anyway, I realize that we need to go deeper into this next time, but I really urge that we do that.
We can talk further about how we might approach that. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So this is the other source of funding that the city provides to rental housing, and that's the operating and maintenance funding commitments. So the city does allocate through the housing levy dollars to primarily support those under 30% of AMI units, and primarily we're talking about the permanent supportive housing units because, again, the operating and services costs are significant. The rents that we could ever get from those folks, if we can get any, is pretty small. So the city has recognized the need for a small ability to provide subsidy, and so we have done that for each of the last, I think, 3 levies. What the city provides is about $2,500 a unit per year. That covers, maybe half the cost of just the operating, not including the services piece. We really do look to our other sources of funds to help fill that gap on the services side. So you can see that in 2016, we allocated about $1.2 million. This was the tail end of the 2009 levy, and we funded 13 units. We did meet our goal, I think, of funding about 220 units with the 2009 levy. And 2017 was that first year of the new housing levy. Move to the next slide. You can see that we don't actually, when we make capital commitments to, say, a permanent supportive housing unit project, we don't actually make the operating subsidy commitment at the same time. And really the simple fact is because we don't make that commitment until the unit is actually up and ready to operate. So we track the fact that they may be requesting some O&M at some point, but we don't actually make a commitment to that unit of that operating subsidy until the project is getting ready to open. Again, we are a small contributor to the total operating and services costs. When you look at both operating and the services piece for permanent supportive housing, we are looking at $17,000 a unit per year cost, and that is a 20-plus year commitment that's made. So when the city make an O&M commitment, it's $2,500 a year for 20 years. So it's a big commitment, and we would have to be looking at a similar thing if we were going to do some more of permanent supportive housing dollars. Again, other key sources of operating and services, federal McKinney has been a very significant source for us. We are facing some disappointment with that funding source this year in particular. We hope that that's not going to be the way it is going forward because, frankly, we made some assumptions with the levy that we would be able to tap into that source over the 7 years. So we're hoping that that situation will improve. King County is another big source of funding for services. They've had great success in some of these recent levies, but we also have a lot of projects that are being supported by the county, and so they're doing a lot of renewals of existing service commitments, and not sure that there is a big amount of dollars coming in the future that's going to provide new sources for service dollars. Seattle Housing Authority provides vouchers. They have committed 300 vouchers to the 2017 levy. This provides a fairly significant subsidy to under 30% PSH units, and we are grateful for that. And then we have other sources that have included United Way in the past, who has reduced a little bit of their support in recent years, but still does provide some support, as well as some other philanthropic opportunities or agencies that provide some assistance. I think that is all that I have to say about this.
So depending on how we look at it, we are either 40 minutes behind our agenda or 10 minutes behind our agenda, depending on whether or not we're willing to count the questions and answers that were peppered throughout the presentation as our open discussion. So that's just my cue to ask for folks if they have additional comments or questions to keep them brief so that we can move on to the next item on our agenda.
I had one comment from much earlier on in the presentation, and it's I guess the second slide, looking at the annual homelessness count in King County that Alan reviewed, and I just want to note that that slide begins in 2013. And if you were to extend the time period of the data table back to 2009, you would see that the total number in that right-hand column was flat for the years of the recession, 2009 to 2013. It's 2013 when there was a large spike in the number going forward over time, and that coincides with the rise in rent prices in the community. And so it's just making the point that there's a very direct relationship to the large increase in homelessness when the rent prices in the community started to skyrocket. We had a large problem before this, but during the recession, when rents weren't going up, the scale of homelessness remained flat during that period of time.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Are there any numbers on the cost of administering the employee head tax program?
Dan, cost of administering the employee head tax program?
I'm sorry, I don't know those all offhand, but we can follow up.
Okay, all right.
I'd be curious if the overall raise, if we decide the number is $12 million we need to raise,
Right.
and it costs $3 million, or if it's 50 that we need to raise, and the cost is it 6 or still 3? It'd be interesting.
I don't have the answer either, but I know that we should have some information about how much it costs to administer the prior tax. That would probably be higher because the exemptions that were provided were complex to administer, but.
Great, okay, let's move on to the review of the letter to one table. Shannon's got copies, and she'll distribute them. We also sent out, I believe, in the email. If we could just take a moment to review the letter. Don't want to get, I'd be interested to hear people's general feedback about it. Don't think this is the time or the place to do wordsmithing, but want people's wordsmithing edits after this meeting. But if there are general themes that we're missing, that's the kind of thing I'd like to hear now.
I just had a question on thank you. I just had a question on the appropriateness of possibly inviting a bridge member between the one table and our table. I think the tone of this letter assumes that that the members are not cemented at this time, but if that were to change in the time we're meeting, I just didn't know if that sort of invitation would be inappropriate.
Thoughts about that? Okay, seeing no strong thoughts either way, we'll work in an invitation.
I think it's important somehow to highlight what a progressive tax is. I feel like the definition is kind of buried, so if you could just shift it in a way so it's more highlighted that that's really what the focus of this is supposed to be.
Thank you. Fox? Any other thoughts? So let's think about getting edits. Folks have them into Ashley by maybe Monday. Does that sound doable to everybody?
Should we email the whole group or just Ashley?
Oh, that's a good question. If they're just wordsmithing edits, I think just sending it to Ashley is fine, and we'll send out the final version final draft version before we send it. That way there won't be a whole lot of cross emails.
I believe the One Table Group is having their first meeting on Monday, so we might want to have a letter sent prior to that so they can consider it in their initial meeting.
Do you know what time it is?
Morning, I think.
That might be a little challenging, but let you guys let me know. Can folks get edits in by, say, 2 o'clock tomorrow?
Sure.
And so what I would ask is you get edits in by 2 o'clock tomorrow, but also then be prepared to review the final that Ashley sends out by about 4. And that way everything goes smoothly and everybody's on board by about 4. We'll send it out at close of business on Friday.
Is this something that requires a vote of the
I think we can hear from folks via email.
Okay.
And if we don't hear any objections to the final version that you should be receiving by about 4 tomorrow, we'll take that as a thumbs up. So that just, I mean, I want to be respectful of what people's obligations are tomorrow between 2 and 4, and make sure that we are not creating a circumstance where we're going to send out a final version without everybody's input if folks aren't able to be at a computer during those times. Not seeing any problems here. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, moving on to discussion of next steps. So the next task force meeting is February 1st from 9 to 11 in this same location. Kirsten will be facilitating this meeting, and I think my office staff will be providing support. And just want to chat a little bit about what we have talked about as inclusion for the next meeting. And I've got our work plan. Does this include the updates from the last meeting?
That's current as of the date on the top.
Okay, great. So fantastic. So what we're talking about on the meeting on the 1st are some subcommittee report backs. And perhaps before or after this meeting concludes, you might want to do like we did last time and have short check-ins, unless everybody's already talking to one another about sort of intent for the subcommittees to meet next week. If that's not necessary because you've already been communicating, then that doesn't need to happen. But if we are expecting subcommittees to meet next week and then be prepared to report back on February 1st, I just want to make sure that we all have sort of the infrastructure created and the expectations set to do that. We're also going to be reviewing the definition of a progressive income tax. We've been working with the IRS's definition. So that was the definition that was included in the resolution that constituted this body. But I think there has been interest in reviewing that to see whether or not there are additional clarifications or refinements that we want to make to that definition. We're also going to be reviewing the council's revenue target as established in Resolution 31872. We'll be reviewing alternative revenue sources, including those listed in the Cities at Work article that was sent out before our first meeting for new task forces. We'll make sure that you guys get the article as well if you haven't already.
And that article will also be up on the website, which has now been recreated. I think we'll go by it tomorrow, that has materials from our meeting as well.
We'll discuss pros and cons of any identified alternatives, including an analysis of the viability of the alternatives and the projected impacts of those sources on low-income people. And then we'll have a review from central staff of the needs and costs related to assisting people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless in obtaining and retaining stable housing. To Lisa Dugard's point, we'll incorporate there some discussion of how people with the highest barriers are prioritized within our funding and policy decisions. And finally, we'll identify recommendations for spending priorities. That'll be sort of a beginning conversation that will be continued in the fourth meeting. Kate. So Mike, coming your way.
So since the revenue tax caucus is actually going to meet next Friday, I'm wondering whether it would be possible to have some of this information from central staff on alternative revenue sources available in time for that meeting.
So review alternative revenue sources, including those in the So Katie is asking for some assistance in pulling together. There was a request earlier that we take those revenue sources and we kind of do a thumbs up, thumbs down, whether or not those things are possible within the context of Seattle's laws and limitations that we might have in place. So it's a little follow up. We'll look to see whether or not.
Yeah. Just the more information we can have for that meeting, the better.
Because,
more productive our discussion will be.
Completely understandable. You don't want to spend your time discussing alternatives that we can't put into place. Other thoughts about the next meeting? All right, great. Let's see. Looks like we do have the two caucus meetings scheduled. We've got the Revenue Use Caucus on January 26th, 4 in City Hall Room L280. And then we have the Revenue Generation Caucus meeting also on Friday, the 26th, from 3:30 to 5 at City Hall in Room 370. The other thoughts before we move on to public comment? And I believe we don't have anybody signed up. That's right, back on schedule.
I don't know that people knew that they needed to sign up, so I think there are people who want to speak.
Oh, is that the case? Do I see some nodding heads? If we can see a show of hands for the folks who are intending to utilize public comment, so I can get a sense of the time. No?
Okay, yeah. Oh, I have a statement that was given to me by OPEIU Local 8, and they weren't able to send someone, but I was wondering whether someone could read that as a public comment. Oh. Is that?
Yes, that's.
Would that be okay? Do you want? Okay, I'll read it. Okay. I thought people were going to give public comment. Okay. OPEIU Local 8 represents hundreds of members providing direct services to people experiencing homelessness in the city of Seattle. And we hope funding decision makers understand that investing in living wages for these workers is not just the right thing to do because they're providing difficult and essential services for our city, but is also critical to creating a functioning system to end homelessness. For service providers, building trusting relationships with their clients is key to being able to help the client overcome the barriers to housing. But high turnover in these low-wage, stressful jobs undermines that trust and re-traumatizes the clients. The high turnover is largely because of the low wages. People cannot afford to have their work be that stressful and their finances be that stressful. Although management at the agencies often agree at the bargaining table that their employees should be paid more, again, not only because they deserve more, but because it would improve outcomes, the message we get is that wage increases are not built into grants and other funding, and therefore agencies cannot afford it. So many of the workers providing direct homeless services are on the verge of homelessness themselves. They're living paycheck to paycheck and cannot weather even a small bump in the road. Many of them are in crisis mode themselves while trying to help clients. This creates a stressful environment that is unfair to the service providers and the homeless clients. Lastly, many of our members work in emergency and day services who were notified at the end of November that funding for their program was not being renewed and would end December 31st. We do not believe it's responsible to cut these services that so many people currently rely on, but cutting them with such short notice is especially irresponsible and totally disrespectful to the workers. It gives them no opportunity to look for another job, and the agencies have no opportunity to keep them on through attrition. For workers in the financial situation I described before, this decision actually creates homelessness in our city. We hope that in the future, more consideration for the workers will be taken into account.
Can you public comment real quick? Hi, can everyone hear me? I'm Karen Taylor. I use she and her pronouns. Before I speak, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on unceded Duwamish land. It's stolen land. All processes that we do on this land, this building, everything, they started out with basically genocide. So let's keep that in our minds as we go through this process. It's always important to remember. What I'd like to speak to is just generally the process of the meeting. And I'm not asking for any major changes, but I noticed a few things in the process of the meeting. We just have regular old processes that we go through. People are used to what a meeting looks like, right? People ask questions if you ask them. If this task force is to talk about very vulnerable people or people who haven't been represented very well, it has to go beyond just who the members are into the process of the meeting a little bit. So for example, I would love it if I wasn't here at the beginning, but if you all acknowledged that this was on stolen Duwamish land, that would help. Another thing is there's a few process things that help. You could also ask at the beginning that folks who are typically very privileged, like white men, think about whether they're really the ones who are going to be speaking a lot. I was happy to see Katie and stuff, but just an acknowledgement of that, like, you know, maybe take a step back. Some process things you can do to make sure that happens, which are scientifically proven, is wait a little bit longer once you've asked a question. It's a little uncomfortable. We have a normal amount of time we wait. If you wait a little longer, it's shown that women will speak up more. They'll think a minute about the question and then speak up. That's just a science thing. So if you wait a little longer, it's just a co-chair thing, think about. Another thing is it's been shown that underrepresented voices are more heard when you pass a mic or something, some kind of around the entire circle. Some people are not comfortable, they're not used to, it's socially censured for them to speak up when a question is asked. It's just part of the deal, and it's been shown scientifically that if you ask a question, especially a very important question, if you pass a mic or pass the pointing around so that each person has a chance to speak, then underrepresented voices, folks we don't normally hear from will speak, and they have ideas and opinions. And those are just some process notes for y'all to take into consideration as you lead these meetings, because it matters how we lead the meetings about things like this. Thank you.
everybody for your participation and your willingness to put your sleeves up and dig into this work. Special thanks to the new members of the task force for joining us. And I think our next meetings, we're really going to be getting into the meat of what the alternatives are and hopefully helping us move towards get into a place where we can do some decision making. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you all in a couple weeks.
Here again.
The next one.